From the mid to late 19th century, the Baptist Missionary Society, formed in England in 1792, set up mission stations in West and Central Africa, and went to work attempting to Christianize the natives. Some of the more prominent names among the missionaries sent were George Grenfell, William Bentley, Thomas Comer, John Weeks, and a handful of others. This video will be about the slavery practices of the natives. Slavery was one of the major age-old customs of the natives that missionaries and colonization efforts sought to stamp out. This video discusses not just the physical practice, but the psychology and attitude of the African natives on the institution of slavery. Let's begin. According to the return made by the King of the Congo, in 1548, about 7,000 slaves were annually shipped from his kingdom. Over time, this number exponentially increased, draining the region of its inhabitants. These slaves were sold to Europeans by the Congo king himself and various other African slave traders. In 1880, the natives of San Salvador were afraid to travel too far out of their district on account of the retaliation they would most likely receive due to the abundance of slave raids they had engaged in against their neighbors. The San Salvador natives would form a slave hunting party and fall on a helpless, unsuspecting village before dawn. They murdered any men who fought back in self-defense, while carrying off mostly the women and children. Sometimes the inhabitants of a targeted village, apprised of the imminent raid, would escape by fleeing into the woods. Whenever this happened, the slave raiders would burn chili pepper into the wind, letting the smoke waft into the woods in the direction of the escaped natives. Sure enough, coughing was soon heard, and all were found and enslaved. The African natives had no moral scruples in terms of the methods they used to procure slaves. Slaves were a common currency in Africa. In 1881, the chief of Manzi paid a yearly tax of 5 slaves to his superior chiefs at Nsanda. They in turn paid a tribute in slaves to the chiefs of Boma. It was a common practice for Africans to trump up all kinds of ridiculous charges against each other in order to enslave their own brethren. Slaves were demanded as restitution for what was oftentimes a false conviction. Families would sometimes be forced into selling off all of their slaves, and then have to sell the younger members of their own family into slavery. Men were known to gamble away all of their slaves in a game, and not uncommonly, even gamble or sell themselves into slavery. It was a traditional African law that runaway slaves must be returned to their owners by whoever came upon them. If a slave ran off from their village and came to a European factory or fort, native law dictated that they be returned. And they were. Natives selling each other into slavery was not uncommon. For example, when their master at Boma died, 3 of his slaves were given their liberty. They traveled 8 miles to a European factory at Kai, and asked if they could trade with the white men there. It wasn't long before 2 of the men came in with the other and sold him as a slave. Not long after, one of the remaining 2 sold the other. There were many cases of natives selling themselves into slavery. They reasoned that it was better to have some money in their pocket from their sale, along with protection and the society of others, as opposed to living free out in the woods, where there were all kinds of dangers, particularly slave hunters and cannibals. Far from being opposed to the institution of slavery, many slaves bought and owned slaves themselves. At Bonny in Nigeria, the slaves wouldn't work for any white men because their African masters took all of their pay. The masters wouldn't work because they had slaves to work for them. While at San Salvador, William Bentley and some of the other missionaries met a young slave boy named Tembelela. They called him Temb for short. Temb was about 6 or 7 years old, a shy little antelope of a boy. He was neglected and treated poorly by his master on account of him being so small and of not much use to him. Temb had come from Bamba, a town between San Salvador and the west coast. There had been a terrible drought in Bamba, followed by famine. The people were dying of hunger. Natives from the surrounding districts brought food to Bamba, but not for the inhabitants' relief. It was used to purchase them as slaves. The situation was very selfishly and callously exploited. Parents sold their children and children sold their parents. Everyone sought to sell their neighbor. Temb's master was able to purchase him for only 5 cobs of maize. Temb hadn't been seen for some time, and Mr. Bentley inquired after his whereabouts. He was told that Temb had been suffering from measles, or some such complaint, and had passed away. The following day, as he was returning from a visit to the king, Bentley saw a little skeleton lying among some leaves on the side of the palaver square. It was Temb, and he was alive. Barely. Bentley immediately brought him to his house to try and save his life. His cruel master had said that he didn't want to waste good food on a dying slave boy, and had him tossed into the jungle to die. Temb had somehow managed to crawl to where Bentley had found him. Bentley went to the king, explained the situation, and asked that he be given custody of the boy. All that the king would say is that there was plenty of time to discuss that if the boy survived. Bentley did all that he could, using every means at his disposal, but Temb died 15 days later. There was a certain method that natives used to enslave each other that involved the giving of cloth at funerals. It was the great desire for a Congo man to be buried in an abundant shroud of cloth, and to have a grandiose funeral. He trades, works, sins, and spares no pains, all to accrue cloth, and to put on a fine display at his funeral. When a friend died, the proper thing to do was to give his family a present of cloth for his funeral shroud. There was no absence of greed in this apparent generosity, for the present of a pig or several animals was expected in return, along with an equivalent present of cloth at the death of the so-called benefactor. This is where the evil came in. If a rich man's enemy died, he would give his rival's family a present of cloth that they would be unable to reciprocate upon his death in the future. Custom forced the accepting of the cloth, even when it was known that its return would be impossible. When the time to return the favor rolled around, not being able to pay the debt, entire families were sometimes forced into slavery. Prominent men were sometimes buried in hundreds of yards of cloth. Junior members of families were sometimes pawned in order to cover the funeral reciprocation gift. Many times, when the funeral was over, these junior members were never redeemed. A successful, superior man was considered to be a witch, and plots of his death abounded. Position could only be attained and held through unscrupulous self-assertion. A cruel and callous man was greatly feared and respected. The more murderous and cruel, the greater he was felt to be, and the greater consideration he received. In Africa, the meek did not inherit the earth, but were killed, enslaved, and not infrequently eaten. Hence the cruelties of African rulers in their attempts to bring some semblance of order. Gentleness, patience, and long-suffering were to them cowardice and weakness. It was deemed inappropriate and unbefitting for a man of importance to have no slaves or wives to serve him in the afterlife. Therefore, these conveniences were provided for him by the execution, or sacrifice, of slaves and wives at his funeral. A prior video on this channel, The Funeral Rites of African Elites, describes in detail one of these funerals. There was an instance of a man being accused of witchcraft, and then shooting the witch doctor who accused him dead on the spot. This man had to pay an indemnity to the witch doctor's family of 20 slaves. Slavery was such in Africa that natives would get jealous of their neighbors and tribal members if they owned more slaves than them. It was a sort of savage keeping up with the Joneses. The African ideal for a man was to attain an abundance of wives and slaves. You could almost say that it was their version of the American dream. At markets, slaves were sometimes advertised as being for sale by their owners putting a plantain leaf around their necks. In currency terms, William Bentley observed that slaves were the consuls, or bonds, of Africa. As an example of the extreme callousness and the dehumanizing way in which African masters viewed and treated slaves, an incident occurring at Kizinga in 1886 will bring clarity. A native man from Longo was sent on his way to Wathen to deliver some mail. 3 hours from Wathen, in Kizinga, the man was murdered. The natives at Kizinga, in restitution, sent 2 slaves to Longo. The missionaries having been at Longo and having stopped the slavery practices there, this was rejected as a proper restitution. The Kizinga natives were baffled. To them, a slave was a slave. They were possessions, objects, beasts of burden. It was their view that if 2 slaves were given for the loss of one man, then the receiver of the 2 slaves made a profit. Slavery was so ingrained in African culture that when the native workmen of the missionaries could afford it, they immediately purchased slaves for themselves. One of the numerous uses of slaves in Africa was to seal the promulgation of a new law by being sacrificed. When the slave for this purpose was killed, it served as an example of what would happen to those who broke the new law. For example, the chiefs making the law will pool their money together to purchase a slave. The slave is then executed and put on display somewhere for months. George Grenfell observed one of these sacrificed slaves hanging in a conspicuous tree for many months. While attempting in vain to stop 2 young slaves from being sacrificed at a funeral, George Grenfell was remonstrated by the family of the deceased. In an angry, defiant tone, they spat rhetorical questions at him. "Are these slaves who are about to be killed your friends? Do they belong to this country? Are they not strangers? Are they not bought and paid for?" Seeing that his pleas were useless, Grenfell and company began to make their way off from the diabolical scene. As soon as the missionaries' backs were turned, the 2 young slaves were executed. There were instances of slaves running off to the missionaries for refuge when they found out that they were to be sacrificed. The missionaries would pay their masters redemption money, but it made no difference. The money used to purchase their freedom was used by their former masters to purchase more slaves to replace them, which were then sacrificed all the same. In 1890, while the workers and inhabitants at a European station were hauling a steamer out of the water, a crowd was noticed on one of the nearby adjacent islands. Upon inquiring the reason for the gathering, it was found that a slave had run away and was being publicly beheaded as an example to the other slaves. The following day, another slave ran off and received the same fate. When George Grenfell urged the natives to give up these cruel customs, they explained to them that he didn't understand the nature of African slaves, and that they had to be executed from time to keep the rest of them in order. The chief in this territory, who was well paid by the Europeans for permission to have a station there, showed up one day offering a slave for sale. When he was turned away, he said nothing. Unperturbed, he silently walked off. A few minutes later, the head of the slave who was being hawked for sale lay bleeding in the dust. The chief was perfectly cool about it, saying that if they had purchased the slave this wouldn't have happened. In 1890, the colonial government called all of the people together and warned them against the burying alive of slaves at funerals, and the generally reckless way in which slaves were killed. The natives were highly averse to the new state, feeling that the European colonial government was morally wrong for making them stop their age-old customs. At a missionary station in Mansem, the natives were very disappointed that the white missionaries there didn't want to buy any slaves from them. At first, the natives had tried to sell them ivory, which was refused, leaving the natives confused. When the missionaries next refused to buy slaves, the Mansem natives thought that the missionaries were downright demented. The missionary John Weeks observed the funeral of a chief where 2 of his wives and a slave were sacrificed. The slave was beheaded, and the bloody head was placed in the grave as a pillow for the deceased chief. As per custom with many tribes, the headless body of the slave was then eaten. Not long after, in the same town, Weeks heard that a woman was being murdered, and rushed to the scene to investigate. He came upon a woman whose arms were securely tied and pegged to the ground. Weeks asked the woman's husband if he was going to kill her. The husband said yes, we were, but now somebody is going to buy her. Weeks of course tried to remonstrate and put a stop to this. In an angry, impudent tone, the husband said to Weeks, "It is not your business. Do you have guns and soldiers? Do you want to fight us? If not, go back to your house. She is my wife, and I will do with her what I please. I can kill her or sell her just as I like." There were native necklaces made from the leg bones of fowls that were counted as treasures, only to be worn by the high status. Any slave who attempted to wear this type of necklace was executed. As another example of the character and views of black slave owners in Africa, a Ngom native named Zaka serves as a prime example. The missionaries hired a slave of Zaka's to be a carrier for them. A day or 2 later, Zaka calmly and coolly told the missionaries that he had killed him. Shocked, they asked what for. Zaker said that he did not want that slave to carry for them, that he was very likely to run off, so he killed him. Observing the missionaries' distress at this, Zaker assured them that they need not worry, he would replace the slave with another. It never occurred to him that someone would be upset about the killing of a slave in itself. Another instance revealing African attitudes toward slavery was put on display during a conversation William Bentley and his wife had with some native women. The women asked him why he only had one wife, insisting that it was much better to have a great many. If he only had one wife, there would only be one woman to cry over him when he died. One may as well be a slave and have a pauper funeral, they said.